Elena Vasquez moved through the bustling corridors of the Pentagon's Strategic Operations Center like a shadow among giants. Her sensible flats made no sound against the polished floors as uniformed officers strode past, their conversations filled with urgent tactical discussions that never included her input. She clutched a manila folder containing logistics reports that had taken her 3 sleepless nights to compile, knowing full well that Major Bradley Thornfield would barely glance at her work before dismissing her from the morning briefing. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her tired face as she paused outside Conference Room Delta. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the assembled military leadership hunched over satellite imagery and tactical displays. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red pins that seemed to multiply each day. The crisis in the eastern Mediterranean had been escalating for weeks, and Elena had been tracking supply lines, troop movements, and resource allocations with the precision of a master chess player anticipating moves 20 steps ahead. She knocked softly on the door frame, waiting for acknowledgement that rarely came with any warmth. Major Thornfield looked up from his position at the head of the table, his expression already showing the familiar mixture of impatience and barely concealed annoyance that appeared whenever civilian contractors dared to interrupt military proceedings. "Come in, Vasquez," he said curtly, not bothering to look at her as she entered. "I hope those supply reports are finally accurate this time. We don't have time for your department's usual mistakes." Elena felt the familiar sting of his dismissal, but maintained her composure as she approached the table. The other officers continued their heated discussion about helicopter deployment schedules and ammunition requisitions, their voices overlapping in a chorus of tactical urgency that filled the sterile room. She placed the folder carefully beside the major's coffee cup, noting how his hand moved protectively over the documents, as if her presence might contaminate his important work. "Sir," she began quietly, "there are some discrepancies in the eastern supply corridor that I believe warrant immediate attention. The fuel consumption rates don't align with the reported aircraft operations, and the ammunition requests seem to exceed standard combat projections by nearly 40%. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar situations where someone's expertise was overlooked in your community." Major Thornfield finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, his gaze carrying the weight of 20 years of military hierarchy and an unwavering belief that civilian contractors existed solely to handle paperwork and supply chains. His weathered face showed no interest in her observations, only the practiced patience of a career officer dealing with administrative nuisances. "Vasquez," he said with deliberate slowness, as if speaking to a child, "we have actual military strategists handling the tactical analysis. Your job is to ensure our supplies arrive on schedule, not to question operational decisions made by people with actual combat experience." The room fell silent for a moment, and Elena could feel the eyes of every officer trained on her. Colonel Patricia Manning shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Lieutenant Commander James Rodriguez studied his hands with sudden fascination. The weight of their collective dismissal pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force, but something deeper than professional pride kept her standing straight. "I understand, sir," Elena replied evenly, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "However, the mathematical inconsistencies suggest either supply theft or unreported operations that could compromise our logistical support for the primary mission." Major Thornfield's jaw tightened, and his fingers drummed against the polished conference table with growing irritation. The morning briefing was already running behind schedule, and he clearly had no patience for what he perceived as a civilian contractor overstepping her boundaries in matters far beyond her comprehension or authority. "That's enough, Vasquez," Major Thornfield said sharply, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Your concerns have been noted and will be filed appropriately. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have real strategic matters to discuss." Elena felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up her neck, but years of working in military environments had taught her to absorb such dismissals without visible reaction. She nodded curtly and turned toward the door, but not before catching sight of the tactical display that dominated the far wall. The digital map showed troop positions scattered across the Mediterranean theater, with supply lines stretching like fragile threads between forward operating bases and rear support facilities. As she walked toward the exit, her trained eye automatically began processing the information displayed on the screens. The fuel depot locations were clearly marked, along with consumption projections that made her stomach tighten with concern. The numbers she had compiled over sleepless nights told a different story than the one being presented to the assembled officers, and the discrepancies were too significant to ignore. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame as she listened to Colonel Manning begin her presentation about helicopter deployment schedules. The colonel's crisp voice filled the room as she outlined plans that would require fuel reserves Elena knew simply didn't exist at the projected locations. The mathematics were wrong, dangerously wrong, and Elena could feel the weight of that knowledge settling heavily on her shoulders. Outside in the corridor, Elena leaned against the cool wall and closed her eyes for a moment. The sounds of the operations center continued around her, a constant symphony of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and urgent conversations that never seemed to pause. She had worked in this environment for 3 years, ever since her discharge from the Army due to a training accident that had ended her military career before it truly began. The injury had been minor, a torn ligament that healed perfectly, but the paperwork classification had been permanent. Medical discharge meant civilian contractor status, which meant invisible status in a world where rank and uniform determined whose voice mattered. Elena had accepted this reality, finding satisfaction in the precise work of logistics and supply chain management. But moments like this reminded her how completely her expertise was dismissed. She opened her folder again and studied the fuel consumption reports that had occupied her attention for the past 72 hours. The patterns were clear to anyone who understood the intricate dance of military logistics. Aircraft flying missions that weren't officially recorded, fuel disappearing from depots faster than operational tempo could explain, and ammunition requests that suggested combat engagements no one was acknowledging in the official reports. Elena had learned to read these numbers like a language, understanding the story they told about operations, efficiency, and sometimes corruption or incompetence. Her background in systems analysis, earned during her brief active duty stint and refined through years of civilian work, allowed her to see patterns that others missed. But recognition of her abilities had died with her military career, buried under the dismissive assumption that civilian contractors were glorified clerks. The conference room door opened behind her, and Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez emerged, his face showing the strain that had become commonplace among the junior officers. He glanced at Elena with what might have been sympathy before hurrying down the corridor toward the communications center. The briefing was clearly not going well, and Elena suspected she knew why. Major Thornfield's voice carried through the partially opened door, his tone growing more agitated as he discussed fuel allocation schedules with someone from the logistics department. Elena could hear fragments of the conversation, enough to understand that the Eastern Supply Corridor was experiencing exactly the shortages her reports had predicted. The mathematical inconsistencies she had identified were becoming operational realities, and people were beginning to notice. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward her small office, a cramped space she shared with 2 other civilian contractors who handled different aspects of supply chain management. Her desk was covered with printouts and spreadsheets that represented hundreds of hours of careful analysis, work that would likely never see the light of day beyond her quarterly reports that disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machinery of military administration. Elena settled into her chair and opened her computer, pulling up the fuel tracking database that had become her specialty. The numbers stared back at her from the screen, telling their story of operations that officially didn't exist and resources that were vanishing faster than anyone was willing to acknowledge. She began typing a supplemental report, knowing it would likely be filed away without review, but unable to ignore the professional obligation to document what she was seeing. The afternoon brought news that Elena had been dreading. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez appeared at her office door, his uniform rumpled and his usually neat appearance showing signs of the stress that had become epidemic throughout the operations center. His face carried the grim expression of someone delivering bad news that everyone had been expecting but hoping to avoid. "Elena," he said quietly, stepping into the cramped space and closing the door behind him. "We need to talk about those fuel projections you submitted this morning." She looked up from her computer screen, where columns of numbers had been dancing before her tired eyes for the past 3 hours. Rodriguez was one of the few officers who treated civilian contractors with basic professional courtesy, and his tone suggested this conversation would be more serious than the usual interdepartmental coordination meetings. "The Eastern Depot at Ramstein is reporting critical shortages," he continued, settling into the folding chair beside her desk. "They're down to 18 hours of operational fuel, and the next scheduled resupply isn't due for another 48 hours. Major Thornfield is asking how our projections could have been so far off." Elena felt a familiar mixture of vindication and frustration wash over her. The numbers had been clear in her morning report, but her warnings had been dismissed as the overly cautious calculations of a civilian contractor who didn't understand operational realities. Now, those same calculations were proving accurate, while the official projections were failing catastrophically. "Sir," she said carefully, "my reports indicated this shortage 3 days ago. The fuel consumption rates at Ramstein have been exceeding official projections by 38% for the past 2 weeks. When I factored in the unreported flight operations that show up in the aircraft maintenance logs, the timeline for critical shortages was predictable." Rodriguez rubbed his temples with the weary gesture of someone who had been fighting bureaucratic battles all day. Elena could see the recognition in his eyes, the uncomfortable awareness that a civilian contractor had identified a critical problem that the military hierarchy had chosen to ignore. The politics of such situations were always complicated, and junior officers like Rodriguez often found themselves caught between accurate intelligence and institutional pride. "What unreported operations?" he asked quietly, leaning forward with sudden attention. Major Thornfield specifically stated that all flight operations in the eastern sector are being conducted according to approved schedules and fuel allocations. Elena turned her monitor so Rodriguez could see the spreadsheet that had occupied her attention for the past week. The data showed a clear pattern of discrepancies between official flight schedules and actual aircraft utilization, tracked through maintenance requirements, parts requisitions, and fuel consumption records that told a different story than the operational reports. These helicopter maintenance logs show rotor hour accumulations that don't match the official mission schedules, she explained, her finger tracing across the columns of data. "Either our aircraft are mysteriously wearing out faster than physics allows, or someone is flying missions that aren't being reported through proper channels." The maintenance requests also show battle damage repairs that don't correspond to any acknowledged combat encounters. Bullet holes don't appear spontaneously, and hydraulic systems don't develop leaks from routine training exercises. The pattern suggests combat operations at a frequency and intensity that exceeds what anyone is officially acknowledging. Rodriguez studied the screen with growing concern, his military training allowing him to quickly grasp the implications of what Elena was showing him. Combat operations meant enemy engagement, which meant threat levels that weren't being properly communicated up the chain of command. Unreported missions suggested either operational security so tight that logistics weren't being properly coordinated or command decisions that were bypassing normal authorization procedures. Elena pulled up another screen showing ammunition requisitions and usage patterns. The data revealed consumption rates that painted a picture of sustained combat engagement, with certain units requesting replacement rounds and equipment at rates that suggested daily firefights rather than the occasional skirmishes mentioned in official situation reports. "The ammunition data tells the same story," she continued, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was revealing. "Forward units are requesting combat resupply at rates consistent with sustained engagement, but official casualty reports and after-action summaries don't reflect that level of enemy contact. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, the full implications of Elena's analysis clearly weighing on him. The disconnect between official reports and logistical reality suggested either a massive breakdown in communication or deliberate misrepresentation of the tactical situation. Both possibilities carried serious implications for operational planning and resource allocation. "Have you shared this analysis with anyone else?" he asked carefully, his tone suggesting the political sensitivity of the information Elena had compiled. Elena shook her head, understanding the delicate position they both found themselves in. Her analysis directly contradicted official assessments, and questioning the accuracy of command reporting was dangerous territory for a civilian contractor. But the mathematical reality of the situation was undeniable, and people's lives depended on accurate logistical planning. "The patterns are too consistent to be coincidental," she said quietly. "Either we have a serious intelligence failure about enemy capabilities and engagement frequency, or someone is conducting operations without proper coordination with logistic support. Both scenarios create dangerous vulnerabilities for our people in the field." Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a harsh sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the small office. Elena watched his face cycle through emotions she recognized from her own military experience. The uncomfortable realization that duty and politics were about to collide in ways that rarely ended well for junior personnel. "I need to take this to Colonel Manning," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that could define his career trajectory. "She's been asking questions about the supply chain inconsistencies, and your analysis might explain why our operational readiness reports aren't matching reality." Elena felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Her experience with military hierarchies had taught her that being right about inconvenient truths was often more dangerous than being wrong about comfortable lies. Colonel Manning was known for her analytical approach and attention to detail, but she was also a career officer who understood the political realities of challenging established narratives. "Sir," Elena said carefully, "I want to emphasize that my analysis is based purely on logistics data and mathematical patterns. I'm not making tactical assessments or questioning operational decisions. I'm simply reporting what the numbers indicate about resource consumption and equipment utilization." Rodriguez nodded, but his expression suggested he understood the political minefield they were entering. Elena's analysis implicitly challenged the accuracy of official reports, which meant questioning the competence or honesty of field commanders and intelligence officers. Such challenges had a way of creating enemies, even when they were mathematically irrefutable. The office door opened without warning, and Major Thornfield stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the cramped space with an aura of barely controlled frustration. His uniform was perfectly pressed despite the chaos of the day, and his expression carried the particular brand of anger reserved for subordinates who had exceeded their perceived authority. "Rodriguez, what are you doing here?" he demanded, his eyes moving from the lieutenant commander to Elena with obvious suspicion. "We have a crisis situation developing, and I need my officers focused on solutions rather than entertaining theories from civilian contractors." Elena felt herself shrinking back in her chair, the familiar response to authority that had been conditioned into her during basic training years ago. But Rodriguez straightened to his full height, his military bearing asserting itself in the face of superior rank and obvious displeasure. "Sir," Rodriguez replied with careful formality, "Ms. Vasquez has identified significant discrepancies in our supply chain data that may explain the fuel shortages we're experiencing at forward operating bases. Her analysis suggests operational tempo that exceeds official reporting by substantial margins." Major Thornfield's jaw tightened, and Elena could see the familiar signs of an officer whose authority was being questioned in ways that threatened his carefully constructed professional narrative. His eyes moved to Elena's computer screen, where the spreadsheet data still displayed the mathematical evidence of unreported operations and resource consumption patterns. Miss Vasquez, he said with deliberate emphasis on her civilian title, has a habit of overcomplicating simple supply chain management with academic theories that don't reflect operational realities. Our field commanders know their fuel requirements better than someone sitting in an air-conditioned office calculating theoretical consumption rates. Elena felt the sting of his dismissal, but years of similar encounters had taught her to maintain professional composure even when being publicly diminished. She could see Rodriguez struggling with the political dynamics of the situation, caught between mathematical evidence and military hierarchy in ways that rarely ended well for junior officers. However, Elena said quietly, her voice steady despite the intimidating presence of Major Thornfield looming over her desk, the mathematics don't lie about aircraft maintenance requirements or ammunition consumption patterns. The data indicates combat engagement levels that significantly exceed what's being reported in official situation summaries. The temperature in the small office seemed to drop several degrees as Major Thornfield's attention focused entirely on Elena. His expression carried the particular type of anger that career military officers reserve for civilians who dared to question their professional expertise or institutional knowledge. "Are you suggesting," he said with dangerous quiet, "that our field commanders are filing inaccurate reports about their operational status and enemy engagement levels? Because that would be a very serious accusation for a civilian contractor to make about decorated military officers with combat experience." Elena could feel the trap closing around her, the familiar scenario where mathematical accuracy collided with institutional protection and career preservation. She had seen this pattern before, where accurate analysis was suppressed because it threatened comfortable narratives or exposed uncomfortable truths about operational effectiveness. "I'm not making accusations about anyone, sir," she replied carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "I'm simply reporting mathematical patterns in logistics data that indicate resource consumption exceeding projected requirements by statistically significant margins." Major Thornfield moved closer to her desk, his physical presence designed to intimidate and establish dominance in the confined space. Elena could smell his aftershave and see the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of combat experience she would never possess. The weight of his authority and institutional power pressed down on her like a physical force. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Elena could feel Rodriguez shifting uncomfortably beside her, caught in the crossfire of a confrontation that was rapidly escalating beyond professional disagreement into something more personal and dangerous. Major Thornfield's breathing was audible in the cramped space, each exhale carrying the weight of 20 years of military authority being questioned by someone he considered fundamentally unqualified to have opinions. "Miss Vasquez," he said finally, his voice carrying the controlled fury of an officer who had reached the limits of his patience, "your job is to count supplies and file reports. It is not to analyze operational effectiveness or question the integrity of combat veterans who risk their lives every day to keep this nation safe." Elena felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but something deeper was stirring beneath the surface of her practiced deference. Years of having her expertise dismissed had built up like pressure in a sealed container, and Major Thornfield's contempt was pushing against walls that had been weakening for months. She had served too, if only briefly, and her discharge had been medical, not disciplinary. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice carrying a subtle strength that surprised even her, "I understand the chain of command and respect the service of our field personnel. But mathematical reality doesn't change based on rank or experience. The numbers indicate operational patterns that create serious vulnerabilities for the people we're supposed to be supporting." Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously, sensing the dangerous undercurrents flowing through the conversation. Elena could see him calculating political risks and career implications, weighing the mathematical evidence against the institutional pressure to maintain comfortable fictions about operational effectiveness and command competence. "Major," Rodriguez said carefully Perhaps we should present Miss Vasquez's findings to Colonel Manning and let her evaluate the tactical implications. The fuel shortages at Ramstein are real, and if there are unreported operations affecting supply chain planning, we need to address those discrepancies. Major Thornfield turned his attention to Rodriguez with a particular type of disappointment reserved for junior officers who failed to read political situations correctly. Elena could see the lieutenant commander wilting under that gaze, his earlier resolve evaporating in the face of superior rank and institutional pressure. Rodriguez, the major said with icy precision, "I'm disappointed that you would allow yourself to be influenced by civilian speculation about matters far beyond your current level of responsibility. Miss Vasquez's mathematical exercises are interesting academic pursuits, but they have no bearing on operational decisions made by people with actual combat experience and strategic training." Elena watched the exchange with growing frustration, seeing her careful analysis reduced to academic speculation by someone who hadn't even examined the data. The patterns were clear to anyone willing to look objectively at the evidence, but institutional pride and political considerations were creating willful blindness that could get people killed. The office phone rang suddenly, cutting through the tension with its shrill electronic tone. Rodriguez reached for it gratefully, clearly relieved to have an excuse to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. "Operations Center, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez speaking," he said into the handset, his voice carefully professional despite the stress evident in his posture. Elena watched his face change as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end of the line. The color drained from his features, and his free hand began drumming nervously against the edge of her desk. Whatever news was being conveyed was clearly not good, and Elena felt her stomach tighten with anticipation. "Yes, sir, understood," Rodriguez said finally, his voice hollow. "We'll be there immediately." He hung up the phone and turned to face Major Thornfield, his expression carrying the weight of someone delivering news that would change everything. Elena could see the reluctance in his posture, the unwillingness to speak words that would validate her analysis in ways that nobody wanted to acknowledge. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "that was Colonel Manning. The fuel depot at Aviano has gone critical, and 2 forward operating bases are reporting ammunition shortages that weren't predicted in any of our supply projections. She's calling an emergency briefing for all logistics personnel in 10 minutes. Major Thornfield's confident demeanor wavered for the first time since entering Elena's office. The news clearly contradicted his dismissive attitude toward supply chain analysis, and Elena could see him struggling to maintain his authoritative bearing in the face of evidence that supported her mathematical projections. Elena felt no satisfaction in being proven right, only a deep concern for the people who would be affected by the supply shortages she had predicted. Soldiers in forward positions would be operating with reduced fuel reserves and ammunition supplies because her warnings had been dismissed as civilian overreach rather than professional analysis. "Sir," Elena said quietly, addressing Major Thornfield directly, "my projections indicate that 3 more forward bases will reach critical fuel levels within the next 18 hours unless emergency resupply operations are initiated immediately. The mathematical patterns suggest this crisis will continue escalating until the underlying operational discrepancies are acknowledged and addressed." Major Thornfield stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, frustration, and something that might have been recognition. The reality of the situation was making it increasingly difficult to maintain his dismissive attitude toward her analysis. But Elena could see him struggling against institutional instincts that resisted admitting error or accepting guidance from civilian contractors. The emergency briefing room buzzed with an energy that Elena had rarely experienced during her 3 years at the Pentagon. Officers moved with the sharp urgency of people responding to a genuine crisis, their usual measured pace replaced by the clipped efficiency that emerged when theoretical planning collided with operational reality. She followed Major Thornfield and Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez through the corridors, her folder of analysis clutched against her chest like armor against the institutional skepticism she knew awaited her. Colonel Patricia Manning stood at the front of the room, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her gray eyes. Elena had seen the colonel from a distance many times, but had never been in the same room during an actual briefing. Manning's reputation for analytical precision was legendary throughout the operations center, and her intolerance for bureaucratic nonsense had earned her both respect and wariness among her subordinates. The digital displays around the room showed a tactical picture that had deteriorated significantly since Elena's morning dismissal from the previous briefing. Red indicators marked fuel depot shortages across 3 separate theaters of operation, while ammunition stockpile warnings flashed at forward operating bases that had been showing green status just 48 hours earlier. "Gentlemen, ladies," Colonel Manning began, her voice cutting through the murmur of concerned conversations with military authority. "We have a logistics crisis that threatens operational readiness across multiple theaters. The supply shortages we're experiencing were not predicted by our standard forecasting models, and I need to understand why our planning failed so catastrophically." Elena felt her heart rate increase as she realized the implications of the colonel's words. The standard forecasting models that had failed were the official projections that Major Thornfield had defended so vigorously, while her mathematical analysis had predicted exactly the shortages that were now creating operational emergencies. Major Thornfield stepped forward, his posture straight despite the obvious strain of defending failed predictions in front of superior officers. Elena could see the calculation in his eyes, the careful consideration of how to frame the situation in ways that preserve his professional credibility while acknowledging the mathematical reality that was becoming impossible to ignore. "Ma'am," Major Thornfield said with careful formality, "our standard logistics projections are based on official operational tempo reports from field commanders. The fuel consumption and ammunition usage patterns we're seeing suggest combat engagement levels that significantly exceed what has been reported through normal channels." Colonel Manning's eyes sharpened with interest, and Elena could see the analytical mind that had made her reputation beginning to process the implications of what Major Thornfield was saying. Unreported combat operations meant either intelligence failures or command structure problems, both of which fell squarely within her area of responsibility. "Are you telling me," Colonel Manning said slowly, "that our field commanders are either lying about their operational status or conducting unauthorized combat operations that they're not reporting through proper channels?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade, and Elena could feel the collective tension of every officer in the room. Questioning the integrity or competence of field commanders was dangerous territory that could end careers and destroy professional relationships that had taken decades to build. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously, and Elena saw him glance in her direction with an expression that might have been encouragement or warning. The mathematical evidence was clear, but presenting it in this forum would require careful navigation of political sensitivities that could easily destroy her career and his. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, "Miss Vasquez from our logistic analysis section has compiled data that might shed light on these discrepancies. Her mathematical modeling of supply chain patterns has been unusually accurate in predicting the shortages we're currently experiencing." Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her, and the familiar weight of institutional skepticism pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. She had been in similar situations before, where her analysis contradicted comfortable assumptions and challenged established narratives about operational effectiveness. Colonel Manning studied Elena with the same analytical intensity she brought to tactical problems, evaluating not just her words, but her competence and credibility. Elena could see the colonel weighing the political implications of listening to a civilian contractor against the mathematical reality of supply shortages that were threatening operational readiness. "Miss Vasquez," Colonel Manning said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions based on available evidence regardless of its source, "I understand you have analysis that predicted our current supply situation. I'd like to hear your assessment of how we reached this point and what we can expect going forward." Elena stepped forward, her folder trembling slightly in her hands as she approached the tactical displays that dominated the front of the room. She had dreamed of moments like this, opportunities to demonstrate her analytical capabilities to senior leadership. But the reality was more intimidating than her imagination had suggested. "Ma'am," Elena began, her voice steadier than she had expected, "my analysis of fuel consumption patterns, aircraft maintenance logs, and ammunition requisitions indicates combat operations at frequency and intensity levels approximately 40% higher than official reporting suggests." She moved to the digital display and began highlighting specific data points that supported her conclusions, her confidence growing as the mathematical precision of her analysis became apparent to the assembled officers. The patterns were undeniable when presented clearly, and Elena could see recognition dawning in faces throughout the room. The maintenance logs show rotor hour accumulations and battle damage repairs that are inconsistent with reported mission parameters, she continued, her finger tracing across the screen to highlight specific discrepancies. Similarly, ammunition consumption rates at forward bases indicate sustained combat engagement rather than the occasional skirmishes mentioned in situation reports. Colonel Manning stepped closer to the display, her trained eye following Elena's analysis with the focused attention of a career officer who had learned to recognize actionable intelligence regardless of its source. The room had fallen completely silent, and Elena could feel the weight of professional reputations hanging in the balance as her mathematical conclusions challenged months of official reporting. "Show me the ammunition data," Colonel Manning said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information too many times to ignore potential intelligence when it presented itself. Elena's fingers moved across the touchscreen interface with growing confidence, pulling up spreadsheets that represented hundreds of hours of careful analysis. The numbers told a story that was becoming impossible to ignore, patterns of consumption that painted a picture of sustained combat operations conducted without proper coordination with logistic support systems. These requisition patterns show forward units requesting combat resupply at intervals consistent with daily engagement rather than the weekly skirmishes reported in official situation summaries, Elena explained, highlighting specific data points that supported her conclusions. The mathematical progression indicates escalating enemy contact over the past 6 weeks, with ammunition consumption increasing by 37%, while official casualty and engagement reports remain relatively static. Major Thornfield shifted uncomfortably behind her, and Elena could sense his growing realization that her analysis was not only accurate, but demonstrated analytical capabilities that exceeded what anyone had expected from a civilian contractor. The political implications were becoming clear to everyone in the room, including the uncomfortable recognition that institutional bias had prevented proper evaluation of critical intelligence. Colonel Manning studied the data with the methodical approach that had made her reputation, cross-referencing Elena's projections with the tactical situation that was deteriorating in real time. The mathematical precision of the analysis was undeniable, and Elena could see the colonel's military mind processing the operational implications of sustained combat operations that weren't being properly reported or supported. "What about medical evacuation requests?" Colonel Manning asked suddenly, her question revealing the deeper tactical thinking that separated senior officers from their subordinates. "If we're seeing this level of combat engagement, there should be corresponding patterns in casualty evacuation and medical supply consumption." Elena felt a surge of professional satisfaction as she realized that Colonel Manning was testing her analysis with the same thoroughness she would apply to any intelligence assessment. The medical data had been part of her original investigation, though she hadn't included it in her initial reports due to the sensitive nature of casualty information. "Ma'am," Elena replied, pulling up another screen of data, medical evacuation requests from forward positions show a 42% increase over the same period, with evacuation patterns consistent with combat injuries rather than training accidents or routine medical issues. The morphine and trauma surgery supply requests correlate directly with the ammunition consumption patterns. The silence in the room deepened as the full implications of Elena's analysis became clear to the assembled officers. Unreported combat operations meant soldiers were fighting and bleeding without proper logistic support, command coordination, or strategic planning. The institutional failure represented by these discrepancies was staggering in its scope and potential consequences. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by the professional confidence of an officer who recognized critical intelligence when he encountered it. Elena could see him making the career calculation that supporting accurate analysis was more important than protecting institutional comfort, regardless of the political risks involved. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, "Miss Vasquez predicted the fuel shortages at Ramstein and Aviano with mathematical precision 3 days before they occurred. Her projections also indicate that additional forward bases will reach critical supply levels within the next 18 to 24 hours unless emergency resupply operations are initiated immediately." Colonel Manning turned her full attention to Elena, and for the first time in 3 years of working in military environments, Elena felt her expertise being evaluated on its merits rather than dismissed based on her civilian status. The colonel's gray eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived decades of military politics without losing the ability to recognize truth when it confronted institutional assumptions. "Miss Vasquez," Colonel Manning said with quiet authority, "I want you to prepare a complete tactical assessment based on your mathematical analysis. Include projections for resource requirements, timeline estimates for critical shortages, and recommendations for emergency supply operations. You have 2 hours to compile a comprehensive brief for presentation to Theater Command." Elena felt her heart racing as she realized the magnitude of what was being asked of her. Theater Command meant generals and admirals, the highest levels of military authority, who would evaluate her analysis against the professional reputations of career officers and institutional policies that had guided operations for months. "Ma'am," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the enormous responsibility being placed on her shoulders, "I'll need access to real-time operational data and casualty reports to provide accurate projections for the next 72 hours. The mathematical models require current battlefield information to generate reliable tactical assessments." Colonel Manning nodded curtly, her decision made with the swift certainty of a senior officer who recognized critical situations when they emerged. Elena could see Major Thornfield struggling with the institutional implications of a civilian contractor being given access to sensitive operational data. But the mathematical reality of the supply crisis was making such concerns secondary to operational necessity. "Major Thornfield," Colonel Manning said without turning from Elena's data display, "you'll provide Miss Vasquez with whatever access she requires to complete this assessment. The accuracy of her predictions suggests analytical capabilities that we need to fully utilize rather than constrain through bureaucratic protocols." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of classified databases, real-time casualty reports, and operational data that painted a picture far more dire than Elena had imagined. Sitting in a secure conference room with access privileges she had never dreamed of possessing, she watched her mathematical projections transform from theoretical analysis into tactical reality that would determine the fate of thousands of soldiers scattered across 3 theaters of operation. The classified casualty reports confirmed her worst fears. Combat injuries were occurring at rates that suggested sustained engagements with a determined enemy, while official situation reports continued to describe the tactical environment as stable with only occasional harassment from insurgent forces. The disconnect between reality and reporting was so profound that Elena began to understand why her supply chain analysis had seemed impossible to senior leadership. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez sat beside her, his security clearance allowing him to witness the compilation of data that was revealing the true scope of the operational crisis. Elena could see the strain on his face as he processed information that challenged everything he had been told about the tactical situation in the Mediterranean theater. "These medical evacuation statistics are staggering," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone confronting uncomfortable truths about institutional competence. How did command intelligence miss combat engagement at this intensity level? Elena continued typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the focused precision of someone who understood that mathematical accuracy could mean the difference between life and death for people she would never meet. The patterns were becoming clearer with each database query, revealing a systematic breakdown in communication between field operations and strategic planning. The medical data suggests that field commanders are either unable or unwilling to report actual combat conditions through official channels, Elena replied, her eyes never leaving the screen as she compiled tactical assessments that would soon be presented to theater command. Either communication systems are compromised, or there are political pressures preventing accurate reporting of enemy capabilities and engagement frequency. The door opened suddenly, and Major Thornfield entered the secure conference room, his expression showing the conflicted emotions of an officer whose professional worldview was being challenged by mathematical evidence he could no longer dismiss. Elena could see him struggling with the institutional implications of her analysis, caught between career preservation and the operational necessity of acknowledging tactical realities. Miss Vasquez, Major Thornfield said with careful formality, Colonel Manning has requested an updated assessment of the timeline for critical supply shortages at forward operating bases. Theater Command needs specific projections for resource allocation and emergency supply operations. Elena pulled up the mathematical models she had been refining throughout the afternoon, incorporating real-time operational data that painted a picture of escalating crisis across multiple fronts. The projections were more alarming than her original estimates, suggesting that several forward bases would reach critical supply levels within hours rather than days. Sir, Elena replied, turning her monitor so Major Thornfield could see the updated projections. The mathematical models indicate that forward operating base Phoenix will reach critical ammunition levels within 8 hours, while Cobra base will exhaust fuel reserves in approximately 14 hours. The pattern suggests coordinated enemy action designed to strain our logistics capabilities beyond sustainable limits. Major Thornfield studied the data with the reluctant attention of someone who had spent his career dismissing civilian analysis, but could no longer ignore mathematical precision that was proving accurate with disturbing consistency. Elena could see him processing the implications of her projections, recognizing that her analytical capabilities exceeded what institutional bias had allowed him to acknowledge. What about enemy capabilities assessment? He asked quietly, his question revealing a growing respect for Elena's analytical approach that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. If your mathematical models are accurate about our supply consumption, what do they suggest about enemy tactical planning and resource coordination? Elena felt a surge of professional validation as she realized that Major Thornfield was finally asking the right questions, treating her analysis as legitimate intelligence rather than academic speculation. She pulled up additional screens showing patterns of enemy engagement that suggested tactical sophistication and strategic planning capabilities that exceeded official intelligence assessments. The timing and coordination of enemy attacks suggests intelligence capabilities that allow them to identify and target our most vulnerable supply lines, Elena explained, highlighting specific data points that supported her tactical assessment. The mathematical patterns indicate that enemy forces are conducting systematic operations designed to create cascading logistics failures rather than pursuing traditional territorial objectives. The patterns suggest they understand our supply chain vulnerabilities better than we do, and they're exploiting mathematical weaknesses in our logistics planning that create maximum operational disruption with minimal resource expenditure on their part. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez leaned forward with sudden attention, his military training allowing him to recognize the strategic implications of what Elena was describing. Enemy forces that understood logistics mathematics could create operational chaos without the massive resource commitments traditionally required for sustained combat operations. Rodriguez turned to Major Thornfield with an expression of growing urgency. Recognizing that Elena's analysis had revealed enemy capabilities that fundamentally changed the tactical situation in ways that required immediate strategic response from Theater Command. "Sir," Rodriguez said with military formality that couldn't disguise his growing alarm, "if Miss Vasquez's assessment is accurate, we're facing an enemy that has weaponized our own logistics systems against us. This represents a fundamental shift in tactical planning that requires immediate escalation to Theater Command level decision-making." The secure phone in the conference room rang with a piercing tone reserved for emergency communications from Theater Command. Elena felt her stomach tighten as Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez reached for the handset, his face already showing the strain of someone who had been delivering increasingly bad news throughout the day. The mathematical projections she had compiled were becoming operational reality faster than anyone had anticipated. "Operations Center, Rodriguez here," he said into the phone, his voice carrying the controlled tension of an officer reporting to superior authority during a crisis situation. Elena watched his expression change as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end of the line. The color drained from his face, and his free hand began the nervous, drumming motion she had come to recognize as his response to overwhelming stress. Whatever information was being conveyed was clearly confirming her worst mathematical projections. "Yes, sir, understood," Rodriguez said finally, his voice hollow with the weight of confirmed disaster. "Miss Vasquez is here with the complete tactical assessment. We'll brief you immediately." He hung up the phone and turned to face Elena and Major Thornfield, his expression carrying news that would change everything they thought they understood about the current tactical situation. Elena could see the reluctance in his posture, the unwillingness to speak words that would validate her analysis in ways that nobody had wanted to acknowledge. "That was General Harrison from Theater Command," Rodriguez said quietly, his words falling into the silence like stones into deep water. "Forward Operating Base Phoenix has gone completely dark. No communications for the past 2 hours, and reconnaissance flights show evidence of sustained combat operations that weren't reported through any official channels." Elena felt the mathematical certainty of her projections colliding with the human reality of soldiers cut off from support and communication. Her analysis had predicted critical supply shortages at Phoenix Base, but the complete loss of communication suggested something far worse than logistics failure. Enemy forces capable of sophisticated tactical planning had apparently achieved their strategic objectives ahead of her most pessimistic timeline estimates. Major Thornfield stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that emphasized the gravity of the situation. Elena could see him processing the implications of what Rodriguez had reported, recognizing that her mathematical analysis had not only been accurate, but had potentially understated the severity of the tactical crisis. "What about Cobra Base?" Major Thornfield asked with the controlled urgency of an officer whose comfortable assumptions about operational effectiveness were crumbling in real time. Rodriguez consulted his notes with the mechanical precision of someone delivering information he wished he didn't possess. Elena could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he became the messenger for tactical realities that challenged everything the command structure thought it understood about enemy capabilities. "Cobra Base is reporting critical fuel shortages exactly as Miss Vasquez projected," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying grudging respect for Elena's analytical capabilities. "They have approximately 6 hours of operational fuel remaining, and the next scheduled resupply convoy was supposed to depart from Phoenix Base before communications were lost." Elena felt the interconnected nature of logistics systems revealing itself with mathematical precision that offered no comfort. The enemy's tactical planning had created cascading failures that would ripple through the entire supply chain, stranding multiple forward positions without adequate resources to maintain defensive operations or conduct emergency evacuation procedures. The mathematical models indicate that enemy forces have achieved strategic logistics disruption with minimal resource expenditure, Elena said quietly, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was describing. "They've identified critical nodes in our supply network and targeted them with timing precision that creates maximum operational chaos. Major Thornfield turned his full attention to Elena, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw genuine respect in his eyes rather than institutional dismissal. The accuracy of her projections had forced him to confront the reality that her analytical capabilities exceeded what military hierarchy had allowed him to recognize or utilize effectively. "Miss Vasquez," Major Thornfield said with careful formality that couldn't disguise his growing recognition of her expertise, "General Harrison wants your complete tactical assessment presented directly to Theater Command within the next 30 minutes. Your mathematical analysis appears to be the only intelligence we have that accurately reflects current operational realities." Elena felt the weight of unprecedented responsibility settling on her shoulders as she realized that senior military leadership was turning to her civilian analysis for strategic guidance in a crisis situation that threatened the lives of thousands of soldiers. Her mathematical projections were no longer theoretical exercises, but tactical intelligence that would guide life-and-death decisions at the highest levels of command authority. The secure conference room door opened, and Colonel Manning entered with the swift efficiency of a senior officer responding to crisis conditions. Her expression showed the controlled intensity Elena had come to associate with military leaders making decisions under extreme pressure, and her presence immediately elevated the gravity of the situation. "Miss Vasquez," Colonel Manning said, without preamble, "General Harrison and Admiral Hendricks want your assessment of enemy tactical capabilities and strategic objectives based on your mathematical analysis. They need to understand what we're facing and how to respond effectively to logistics warfare that appears to exceed our current intelligence assessments." Elena stood to attention instinctively, her brief military training asserting itself in the presence of senior authority. The moment she had been unconsciously preparing for throughout her career was finally arriving, the opportunity to demonstrate analytical capabilities that institutional bias had prevented anyone from properly evaluating or utilizing. The Theater Command briefing room was unlike any space Elena had ever entered during her 3 years at the Pentagon. The walls displayed tactical maps covering 3 continents, while digital screens showed real-time satellite feeds from combat zones where American forces were fighting battles that official reports had barely acknowledged. The air itself seemed charged with the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of thousands of soldiers scattered across hostile territories. Admiral Catherine Hendricks stood at the head of the massive conference table, her silver stars catching the light from the overhead displays as she studied the tactical situation with the focused intensity that had made her legendary throughout the Navy. Elena had heard stories about the Admiral's analytical brilliance and her reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense to focus on operational realities, but seeing her in person was intimidating in ways Elena hadn't anticipated. General Marcus Harrison occupied the chair to the Admiral's right, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding operations that were deteriorating faster than traditional military planning could address. Elena could see him processing information from multiple theaters simultaneously, making calculations about resource allocation and strategic priorities that would ripple through the entire command structure. "Miss Vasquez," Admiral Hendricks said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information. "Colonel Manning tells me your mathematical analysis predicted our current logistics crisis with remarkable accuracy. I need to understand what your projections indicate about enemy capabilities and strategic objectives." Elena stepped forward, her folder of analysis feeling inadequate for the magnitude of the tactical situation she was being asked to address. The assembled officers represented decades of combat experience and strategic planning expertise, yet they were turning to her civilian mathematical models for insights that traditional military intelligence had failed to provide. "Ma'am," Elena began, her voice steadier than she had expected given the unprecedented circumstances, My analysis indicates that enemy forces have identified critical vulnerabilities in our logistics networks and are conducting coordinated operations designed to create cascading supply chain failures rather than pursuing traditional territorial objectives. She moved to the digital display wall, her confidence growing as she began presenting the mathematical evidence that supported her tactical assessment. The patterns were undeniable when viewed objectively, revealing enemy planning capabilities that exceeded official intelligence estimates by substantial margins. The timing and coordination of attacks on supply convoys, fuel depots, and communication nodes suggests tactical intelligence that allows enemy forces to predict our logistics requirements with mathematical precision. Elena continued, highlighting specific data points that demonstrated systematic targeting of American vulnerabilities. They're not trying to defeat our forces through direct combat engagement. Instead, they're using our own supply chain mathematics against us, creating resource shortages that force tactical withdrawals without the massive casualties traditionally required to achieve strategic objectives. Admiral Hendricks leaned forward with sudden attention, her strategic mind immediately grasping the implications of what Elena was describing. Enemy forces capable of logistics warfare represented a fundamental shift in tactical planning that required completely different strategic responses than traditional combat operations. "Are you telling me," Admiral Hendricks said slowly, "that we're facing an enemy that understands our supply chain vulnerabilities better than our own logistics officers?" Elena felt the weight of that question settling on her shoulders, recognizing that her answer would influence strategic decisions at the highest levels of military command. The mathematical evidence was clear, but presenting it to senior leadership required careful consideration of political implications that could destroy careers and institutional relationships. "Ma'am," Elena replied carefully, "the mathematical patterns indicate systematic analysis of our logistics networks by enemy forces with analytical capabilities that allow them to identify and exploit critical weaknesses in our supply chain planning with devastating effectiveness." General Harrison spoke for the first time since Elena had entered the briefing room, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who had commanded troops in combat and understood the human cost of strategic miscalculations. "What do your projections indicate about our ability to maintain current operational tempo?" General Harrison asked, his question revealing concern about fundamental sustainability of American military operations under systematic logistics pressure. Elena pulled up additional screens showing resource consumption patterns and supply chain vulnerabilities that painted a picture of escalating crisis across multiple theaters. The mathematical models indicated that current operations were unsustainable without fundamental changes to logistics planning and strategic priorities. "Sir," Elena said quietly, "the mathematical models indicate that without immediate strategic adjustments to supply chain security and emergency resource allocation, we'll face critical shortages at 60% of forward operating bases within the next 48 hours. The silence that followed her assessment was profound, filled with the weight of strategic implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about American military capabilities and enemy tactical sophistication. Elena could see senior officers processing information that would require complete reevaluation of operational planning and strategic objectives. Admiral Hendricks stood slowly, her movement commanding immediate attention from every person in the briefing room. Elena could see the strategic decision-making process occurring behind the Admiral's eyes, the rapid calculation of options and consequences that separated senior leadership from subordinate ranks. "Miss Vasquez," Admiral Hendricks said with quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire room, "I'm elevating your security clearance and assigning you as Senior Logistics Analyst for Operation Mediterranean Shield. Your mathematical models appear to be the only intelligence we have that accurately reflects current tactical realities." Elena felt the magnitude of Admiral Hendricks' decision settling over the briefing room like a seismic shift in institutional gravity. Every officer present understood that a civilian contractor had just been elevated to senior analytical authority in the middle of a strategic crisis, bypassing decades of military hierarchy and protocol in ways that would send shockwaves throughout the Pentagon's command structure. General Harrison stood beside the Admiral, his expression showing the professional respect that career military officers reserved for demonstrated competence under extreme pressure. Elena could see him processing the implications of her mathematical analysis, recognizing that traditional tactical planning had failed to anticipate enemy capabilities that threatened the fundamental sustainability of American operations. Miss Vasquez, General Harrison said with military formality that carried genuine recognition of expertise, "I need immediate tactical recommendations for securing our supply lines and maintaining operational readiness at forward positions. Your mathematical models appear to be the only reliable intelligence we have about enemy strategic planning and tactical capabilities." Elena moved to the central display console, her hands trembling slightly as she accessed classified databases that contained real-time operational intelligence from combat zones spanning 3 continents. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, but years of mathematical training and analytical discipline provided the framework she needed to focus on tactical realities rather than institutional implications. "Sir," Elena began, pulling up strategic maps that showed American positions and supply lines across the Mediterranean theater. "The mathematical models indicate 3 critical vulnerabilities that enemy forces are systematically exploiting to create cascading logistics failures." She highlighted specific locations on the digital map, her finger tracing supply routes that had been targeted with mathematical precision by enemy forces who understood American logistics better than most American officers. The patterns were clear when viewed objectively, revealing strategic planning that exceeded official intelligence assessments by disturbing margins. "First," Elena continued, "enemy forces are targeting fuel depots and supply convoys at intervals calculated to create maximum resource shortages with minimal combat engagement. They're using our own logistics schedules against us, attacking supply lines when interruption creates maximum operational disruption." Admiral Hendricks studied the tactical display with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades analyzing strategic situations and making decisions that determine the fate of military operations. Elena could see the Admiral's mind processing the mathematical evidence and recognizing patterns that traditional intelligence gathering had missed completely. "Second," Elena said, advancing to the next screen of analysis, "enemy forces are coordinating attacks on communication nodes with timing precision that prevents accurate reporting of combat engagement levels. This creates intelligence failures that compound logistics problems by preventing accurate assessment of resource requirements at forward positions." The briefing room had fallen completely silent, and Elena could feel the weight of senior military attention focused entirely on her analysis. Officers who had dismissed her expertise just hours earlier were now recognizing analytical capabilities that exceeded what institutional bias had allowed them to acknowledge or utilize effectively. "Third," Elena continued, her confidence growing as she presented evidence that supported conclusions months of careful mathematical modeling. "Enemy forces appear to have infiltrated our logistics planning systems, either through cyber warfare capabilities or human intelligence networks that provide them with advanced knowledge of American supply schedules and resource allocation decisions." General Harrison leaned forward with sudden urgency, his combat experience allowing him to immediately grasp the tactical implications of what Elena was describing. Enemy forces with advanced knowledge of American logistics represented intelligence penetration that threatened the security of every military operation currently underway. "Are you saying they know our supply schedules before our own forward commanders receive them?" General Harrison asked, his voice carrying the controlled alarm of someone confronting intelligence failures that could cost thousands of American lives. Elena pulled up additional data screens showing correlation patterns between American logistics planning and enemy attack timing that suggested intelligence capabilities far beyond what official assessments had indicated. The mathematical evidence was undeniable, revealing systematic compromise of operational security at levels that threatened fundamental strategic planning. "Sir," Elena replied, The correlation between our internal logistics, scheduling, and enemy attack timing is mathematically consistent with advanced intelligence access. The probability of such precise targeting without inside information approaches statistical impossibility. Admiral Hendricks walked to the tactical display wall, her presence commanding immediate attention as she studied Elena's analysis with the systematic approach that had made her reputation throughout the military command structure. Elena could see the Admiral processing strategic implications that would require fundamental changes to operational security and tactical planning. The Admiral turned back to face the assembled officers, her expression showing the decisive certainty that separated senior leadership from subordinate ranks. Elena recognized the moment when strategic decisions were being made that would alter the course of military operations and potentially save thousands of American lives. Miss Vasquez, Admiral Hendricks said with quiet authority that seemed to redefine the hierarchy in the briefing room, "I'm implementing your tactical recommendations immediately. You'll work directly with Theater Command to coordinate emergency supply operations and develop countermeasures for enemy logistics warfare." Elena felt the institutional transformation occurring around her as Admiral Hendricks' words established new protocols that elevated mathematical analysis to the same level as traditional military intelligence. The recognition was overwhelming, but the responsibility was even greater, knowing that her recommendations would directly affect the safety and effectiveness of American forces in combat zones. 3 hours later, Elena stood before the largest assembly of military leadership she had ever seen, her mathematical projections displayed on screens that stretched across the Pentagon's primary command center. Generals, admirals, and senior staff officers from every branch of the armed forces had gathered to hear tactical recommendations from a civilian contractor whose name most of them had never heard until that morning. The emergency session had been called after Elena's logistics analysis prevented what could have been the largest tactical disaster in modern American military history. Her mathematical models had identified enemy plans to simultaneously attack 7 critical supply depots, creating resource shortages that would have stranded 12,000 American personnel without adequate ammunition, fuel, or medical supplies in hostile territory. Admiral Hendricks stood at the front of the assembled leadership, her presence commanding the immediate attention of officers whose combined experience represented centuries of military service and strategic planning expertise. Elena could see the Admiral preparing to make an announcement that would fundamentally alter how the military establishment viewed civilian analytical capabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Hendricks began, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose tactical decisions had shaped military operations across multiple theaters of conflict. 12 hours ago, we faced a logistics crisis that threatened the operational readiness of our forces across 3 continents. Elena felt every eye in the room turned toward her as Admiral Hendricks gestured in her direction, recognizing analytical expertise that had proven more accurate and strategically valuable than traditional military intelligence gathering and assessment procedures. Miss Elena Vasquez, a civilian logistics analyst, provided mathematical projections that not only predicted our supply chain vulnerabilities with remarkable precision, but identified enemy tactical planning capabilities that exceeded our intelligence assessments by substantial margins. The silence in the command center was profound, filled with the weight of institutional recognition that challenged fundamental assumptions about military hierarchy and the sources of strategic intelligence. Elena could see senior officers processing the implications of a civilian contractor providing tactical guidance that had proven more reliable than established military analytical procedures. Admiral Hendricks continued, her words carrying implications that would reshape protocols throughout the Pentagon's command structure. Elena's analysis revealed systematic compromise of our logistics planning systems and identified countermeasures that prevented catastrophic supply failures at multiple forward operating positions. General Harrison stepped forward, his expression showing the professional respect that career military officers reserve for demonstrated competence under extreme operational pressure. Elena could see him preparing to make statements that would validate her analytical capabilities in ways that transcended traditional civilian military boundaries. Based on Ms. Vasquez's tactical recommendations, General Harrison announced to the assembled leadership, "We implemented emergency supply operations that successfully resupplied 7 forward operating bases before enemy forces could exploit the vulnerabilities she had identified through mathematical analysis." Elena felt the institutional transformation occurring around her as senior military leadership publicly acknowledged analytical capabilities that institutional bias had prevented them from recognizing or utilizing effectively for 3 years. The validation was overwhelming, but more importantly, American soldiers were safer because mathematical precision had finally been allowed to inform tactical decision-making. Admiral Hendricks raised her hand, commanding immediate silence from the assembled officers whose conversations had been building as they processed the unprecedented nature of the briefing they were witnessing. Elena recognized the moment when institutional protocols were being established that would permanently alter her role within the military command structure. From this point forward, Admiral Hendricks declared with quiet authority that seemed to redefine command protocols throughout the room, "Ms. Vasquez will serve as Senior Strategic Analyst for all theater operations. Her mathematical models have proven more reliable than traditional intelligence assessments, and her recommendations will be given equal weight with tactical guidance from senior military officers." Elena felt the magnitude of that declaration settling over the command center like a fundamental shift in institutional gravity. Admiral Hendricks had just elevated civilian analytical capabilities to the same level as military strategic planning, breaking through decades of hierarchical assumptions about the sources of tactical intelligence and operational expertise. Furthermore, Admiral Hendricks continued, her voice carrying the finality of strategic decisions that would not be questioned or reversed. "No operational planning sessions will proceed without Ms. Vasquez's mathematical analysis. No one moves until she speaks." The words hung in the air with the weight of institutional revolution, transforming Elena from invisible civilian contractor to indispensable strategic asset whose voice would be heard and respected at the highest levels of military command. The recognition was everything she had worked toward throughout her career, validation of analytical capabilities that had been dismissed and underutilized for far too long. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you, or share if you've witnessed similar courage, where hidden expertise was finally recognized in your own community. Elena looked out across the assembled leadership, seeing respect and recognition in faces that had never acknowledged her existence just hours earlier. The mathematical precision that had always been her strength had finally found its proper place within the military establishment, where analytical excellence could serve the people who risked everything to keep the nation safe. Admiral Hendricks concluded the briefing with words that would be remembered throughout the Pentagon for years to come, establishing new protocols that valued mathematical truth over institutional comfort and analytical precision over bureaucratic convenience. Elena's name would never again go unrecognized when critical decisions needed to be made.